Hey guys, I'm going to go ahead and do the 2005 consumer and produce surplus problem for you. I'm starting to pick through some of the older problems and review the micro for you. That's what I'm planning to do here. If you haven't been reading up on the things I've been posting, then the AP exam is going to be only 2 questions and only for 45 minutes. You will not draw any graphs on this year's AP exams, but there very well could be graphs there that you have to interpret. So I don't know if that means it's going to be harder or easier, but what I do know is that we won't be practicing graphing anymore, and instead we're going to be practicing graph interpretation. That doesn't mean that you won't be able to draw graphs on the side when you're taking the test, because obviously you still need to do that and draw those graphs, because when in doubt, graph it out always works. So the problem that you're looking at from 2005, this is a consumer and produce surplus problem, and we have a tax here. So what we're going to do is we're going to just do the simple solutions here that they've got there for you, and I think that's going to be our best bet. I'm also going to go through the calculations here for the math regarding it, because that'll be good practice for us, I think. So we're going to go ahead and read the problem. It says, the graph above shows the market for a good that is subject to a per unit tax. That's a good thing to review right now. Remember, a per unit tax causes a shift, whereas a lump sum tax does not cause a shift. That only causes a change in total profit or total revenue. The letters on the graph represent the enclosed areas, and then letter A says, using the label on the graph, identify the following: equilibrium price and quantity before the graph. Okay, if we get a question like that, we're going to say hallelujah. So equilibrium price before the tax, then of course, is 12, and equilibrium quantity before the tax, of course, is 100. Next, then, it says the area representing the consumer surplus before the tax. And so, making a quick analogy here for you, if we were looking at a graph like this, and here's our equilibrium. Remember, consumer surplus is this shaded area up here that represents the value of what the consumer saved in regards to transaction. So the way that you really interpret that is that we were willing to pay $8 for the good. There were other people willing to pay, let's say, $10 for the good. And then the deal here is that if this is like 100, for example, you just take a look at this whole area, and the difference of the 8 to the 10 is what we call the consumer surplus. These people were willing to pay more up here, but did not have to. They reaped the benefit of the equilibrium, and so they only paid 8. That means they saved $2. Consumer surplus then represents the aggregate. It means the entire. And so what we do is then we have to solve for the area of this triangle to represent the total. And so 1/2 of base times height is how we solve that. And so your base then is 100, right? And your height, why is that not doing that? Okay, what's going on? Sorry, guys. And so it's 100, and then the height is this distance here. So here's the base of 100, here's the height here of 2, so 2 times 100, but it's 1/2, of course, and so that means that it's 200, but it's a half, and so that means it's $100. That's the consumer surplus on this problem I just made up. But that's not what the question is asking. If you go back to it, they want to know the area of the consumer surplus, and so just taking a quick look here, we know then that what we just said a second ago is that the consumer surplus is the area above equilibrium. And so your answer then is going to entail those letters that we see there. And so your answer would be A, B, C, F on this question. And so the answer for consumer surplus before the tax is A, B, C, F. So A3 then, the area representing the produced surplus before the tax, that's easy peasy. That's going to be the area down here. Produced surplus is the difference in what the business was willing to accept for the good and then what they in reality got to accept. So in this case, it looks to be, it's EDG is your answer for the area representing the produced surplus, EDG. But if we were doing this mathematically, then what you would do is 1/2 of base times height. So here's the height of 2, here's the base of 100, And so that's 1/2 base times height. So 2 times 100 is 200, and it's a half, so that's 100. Letter B then says, assume now tax is imposed based on the graph. Does the price paid by the buyers rise by the full amount of the tax? Explain. And that's a definitive no. What we learned is that when a tax is applied to a good, then it ends up being imposed half and half on both consumers and producers. So I'm going to just start a quick page here. And what we learned is that we have a supply and demand curve here. This is, of course, your equilibrium. And then when we see a tax imposed, what we see is that the burden of taxation falls, in this kind of graph, equally on both producers and consumers. And so the burden of taxation, it falls on both consumers and producers. This graph is unit elastic, so the burden is equally distributed. If we were feeling fancy, what I could have done is deliberately drawn it with a much different slope. And as a result, you see then that this burden of taxation is not equally distributed. We do something like this, and now if you look at this, the larger portion of the tax falls on the consumers, and a smaller portion of the tax falls on the producers there. Nevertheless, burden of taxation is on both. And what we see here is that letter B says, assume that the tax is now imposed. Based on the graph, does the price paid by the buyers rise by the full amount of the tax? No. The price paid by the buyers is going to rise by a portion of the tax. And if we were using this labeling specifically, we could see then that the burden of tax went to here. That's your new equilibrium price. And so the tax was only $1 on the consumers and then $1 on the producers. And then the height of this rectangle, of course, is 2. So this is a $2 tax. $1 up, $1 down. And then finally, letter C. Using the labeling on the graph, identify each of the following after the imposition of the tax. After the imposition of the tax. The net price received by the sellers. Okay, so after the tax then, what we see is the tax revenue for the government is going to be this area there, which is BCD. This is your tax revenue. This tells me then that I now have to pay $13 for the good. The government is going to get to keep the first $2 of the value of this good, and then the businesses are only going to receive $11. So the answer to C1, the net price received by the sellers, is $11. The amount of tax revenue. Now, revenue means total. This is a $2 per unit tax, but we are selling 80 goods in this scenario. That means our tax revenue is $160. The area representing the consumer surplus, as a result of the tax, we see a very small area of consumer surplus. Only letter A is left out of the consumer surplus. If you pay attention in class, you know then that letter B, C, and D are the area of tax revenue. So government gets to keep all that money. And then we learned that consumer surplus, that's all that's left is this little tiny area up here. I believe that is letter A. And then finally, it says the area representing the deadweight loss. Deadweight loss represents the inefficiency or market failure that happens as a result of a government intervention in a market. And as a result, we see that we're no longer producing where we ought to be at 100, and instead we're producing 80. That means that this area here, FG, has been lost to the entire economy. That means FG is the area of the deadweight loss. If we were calculating deadweight loss, which we should do just for fun, what we would see then is that this is another triangle. So again, 1/2 of base times height. The height of this triangle looks to be 2, and the base is only this length there, that's 20, so 2 times 20 is 40, but it's half, so the answer to the deadweight loss would have been $20 if we were doing the math on it. Always practice the math, guys. I really think on this year's AP exam, we're going to have graph interpretation with math. A lot of math. I hope this helped. Hope you guys are having a glorious, glorious week here. Take care of yourselves.